Thanks, Dario. Thanks for the introduction. For those of you who weren't at my session earlier on this morning, I'm Danny Preiskel, Senior Partner of Preiskel & Co. Telecom Specialised Law Firm, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And actually, it's very interesting following on from Noah's last observation about the FCC and the FTC not standing up to, in effect, Silicon Valley. That brings us up very nicely to actually the legislation that the European Union has actually recently enacted to actually address many of the points that Noah was saying are not being addressed but in the US. And the beauty is, we'll see, is the extraterritorial effect. But what I'll do now is just ask Innocenzo and Simona to say a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get cracking. So over to you,
Good morning. I'm a lawyer who has been dealing with telecom and digital regulation since the beginning in the liberalization. And I was general counsel fiscally and been chairing a trade association in Brussels. And normally, so I'm advising operators and governments in Brussels on digital and telecoms.
Thanks, Innocenzo, and great to have you on board. And Simona?
Good morning, everyone in the room and everybody online. I'm Simona Lipstaite. I'm the director for UK and Europe at Access Partnership. We are a leading technology policy consultancy and been around since 1999. So I work a lot on policy issues in Brussels, member states, and the UK. But we also have teams working on compliance, market access, and infrastructure, for example, spectrum at the multilateral level. So pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Simona. So I'll just start off. Having seen the frustrations in the US, just asking Innocenzo, I mean, in this session we're talking about the European Union Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Are they going to have a territorial effect, and are they going to impact on Silicon Valley in the US?
Yes, that's what is happening now with this wave of regulation coming from Brussels, that those rules do not apply just on companies which are based within the Union, which is still a duty for other reason, but apply to any operator which is going to provide services and affect the users and provide consumers within the EU. This is a rule which is coming from the GDPR. In the GDPR you have the same, exactly the same rules. You cannot escape from the application by saying I'm outside of the Union. In any case, there is an obligation of legislation to have a representative within the EU, which is at the end something is not a burden for big operators. Can become an issue for small operators, because if you are a small company launching a service and potentially targeting the EU market, you may be required to have a legal representative within the EU. This is especially a problem for the DSA, which is catching any kind of operators. For the DMA, which is catching the so-called gatekeepers, the impact is less.
Yeah, thanks to you, Innocenzo. And Simona, do you want to give the audience here and online a brief overview of the DMA and DSA, just so that they have a better feel of what they're addressing?
Absolutely, and I will focus a little bit more on the DMA as well. So the DSA and the DMA is really, we need to look at the overall EU and especially the European Commission's ambition to regulate even more around the world. So emboldened by the far-reaching, I will call it success in the sense that it was very impactful of the GDPR. The European Commission is really trying to make an impact with the other pieces of legislation, so AI Act, and in this case the DSA and the DMA. And the DSA is really looking at long-standing online content issues, and is actually, you could probably spend weeks talking about it, so I won't go too much into the details, but I want to delve into some of the specifics into what we're seeing in the DMA. And the DMA is a complementary tool on competition. So it designates the so-called gatekeepers, which are companies which have to fulfill 3 criteria on how many users you have in the EU, your annual turnover in the EU, and whether you're an entrenched market player or not, which means you have to fulfill these obligations for 3 years at a minimum. However, there are different aspects of it. So, for example, even if you don't fit all the 3 quantitative aspects, but you still have an appearance of a gatekeeper, it is possible that your company will still be affected. To some degree, there could be some obligations, but not others. But what that means in general is that it's certainly something to watch. It's certainly something to go through your legal teams and compliance team and see, do you look like a gatekeeper? Might you look like a gatekeeper in the near future? And if so, the obligations are quite far-reaching. So everything from compliance aspects, and there's a whole checklist. I don't know if Innocenzo wants to also add to that. But also the fines are even more serious than the fines we're seeing under the GDPR.
For those who are familiar with the European telecom law, the DMA is basically the translation of the telecom system into internet. You identify some dominant operators, and you decide ex ante a list of obligations they have to comply with. So the gatekeepers are treated like Telefonica, British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom. So they have to comply with those rules. While until now it was an ex post competition application. You have to wait that the dominant operator makes something wrong and then you intervene.
Thanks, Innocenzo. And Simona, how do you think the DMA will actually affect those larger telcos who could be considered gatekeepers, but also present opportunities to those MEF members who aren't on those sort of very large online platforms, search engines? They should be aware of the rights that they're effectively given vis-a-vis the dominant, significant powers.
Absolutely. So the entire purpose of the DMA is to, enhance competition and maybe to rein in unfair practices. But how that plays out in practice is something to be still discussed. So the DMA is coming into effect the first parts of it in May 2023, which is very soon. And then there will be gradual rollover of specific obligations. But how it's used in practice is a matter of dialogue. So while the gatekeepers will need to be open to dialogue with the smaller members, with the MEF as well, the European Commission still has an absolutely massive role to play. So even though the legislation is complete, there will still be a number of ongoing dialogues. For example, even today, the European Commission is hosting a workshop on interoperability in messaging services. And my advice would be, if you think this is something that would be of benefit to your company and you might use, that you try to attend those sessions and you try to engage in the dialogue still, because the devil will be a little bit in the details, and we're seeing how in practice this will play out. Also, maybe we can turn a little bit into the interoperability obligations.
Yeah, hugely important, especially messaging is such an important strand of the work of the MEF and the members.
So I just wanted to say a few things. The DMA introduces interoperability obligations, both horizontally and vertically, and especially with the vertical ones. With horizontal ones, the way it will be introduced gradually is first for in personal text services, then group text services, and then finally, in a few months' time, video and voice calls, which is largely, I guess there is large agreement on how that's going to play out, although there have been some critical voices saying, well, actually the obligations are not clearly set out, so there might need to be some best practices or use cases. And again, it's a process, so if you think your company is affected or you're not quite clear, it's certainly not a done deal. It's a dialogue that will continue with the Commission. But with the vertical ones, there are quite a few issues that have been raised by industry. So first of all, some people have used, the more we need to open up our vertical services to interoperability, potentially that would include security risks. Maybe that's a criticism that companies have used when they didn't necessarily want to comply, but maybe it's something that will still need to be looked at by the Commission. Secondly, with vertical, there could be potentially endless types of requests that companies receive. And it is unclear whether it's possible to respond to all of them, but secondly, what is the cost of responding to all of them? So some suggestions from companies have been, well, maybe we could introduce some sort of potentially funding or payment system. If you really want vertical interoperability, we will do it, but we cannot do it without some sort of specific funds from the users that request it. And then secondly, there is also a suggestion that perhaps under the guidance or with the oversight of the European Commission, there could be some sort of filtering system for the requests for vertical interoperability, so gatekeepers would still comply, but they might not necessarily have to respond to each and every one request, and the Commission could help them vet a little bit what is reasonable under the DMA. Sorry, I could go on for a little bit, but I'll close now.
Thanks so much. And Innocenzo, how do you see the DMA and DSA affecting the operations of internet service providers and maybe those of the MEF members interacting with internet service providers?
Okay. First, I would like just to add a point on the interoperability. That was a very a long debate in the internet world because interoperability was mandated in the telecoms, of course, because it was an ancillary obligation, the interconnection. So you need to interconnect within telephone networks, and therefore you need also a kind of interoperability. But it was never mandated in the internet because the only legislation you had in Europe, at least is what I'm talking about, was the Directive 2000, which had a very, very few obligations to provide just liabilities about content, illicit content, and so on. The first serious moment when the interoperability question came into the matter was when Microsoft merged with Skype. And when there was that transaction, some companies flagged that there was a problem. One of them was Cisco, for instance, which had a video telephony service. And they went to the Commission and said, you don't have to give a green light to this merger because first you have to oblige those companies to provide interoperability. At that time, Skype was the dominant messaging provider in Europe. So they said you cannot put the same to the companies because we will have then again a situation of bundle and so on. The Commission said no because they said we see the problem, but the mergers does not change anything in our opinion. So this is one of the example of the missed opportunity from the European antitrust. So about the effect of the DSA and DMA, DSA and DMA about internet access provider or internet service provider?
Internet service providers, really.
Well, and now in general, you unlike the system we had, that you had the general horizontal legislation applying few obligations on internet providers, irrespective of what they do. Could be a social platform, or could be a website, or browsing system, and so on. Now you have a more granular legislation, and also a scalar legislation. Means that depending on the size and the impact of your company, you will be subject to different rules. This is more evident in the Digital Service Act, which lists 4 categories of operators, of which the most important are the very large online platform, or also so-called the biggest search engine, which are the company which have 45 million active users. And those operators are more or less also the gatekeepers in the DMA. In the DMA, you will have other additional criteria, which are the capitalization and the turnover, but the impact of the market criteria, so the 45 million users per month, are the same. And those operators will be subject to more important set of obligations, which is of course a problem for them in terms of reporting, in terms of compliance and liability. In terms of competition, is an advantage for the other operators, because then on the DMA you have a list of rules which come from the competition practice, which the bigger operator must comply with, and will give a possibility for a smaller operator to have more competition, like there is a list of do and non-do's, let's say, like the possibility on a device to install or disinstall an app. That's something that many operators have been asking for time.
Yeah.
The fact that you are on a platform, whether the platform owner can use your data even against you to compete with you. So this is a list of examples.
Thank you. And Simona, would you see, so if any of our members were to launch like an independent messaging app, which would say compete with WhatsApp, and they say, well, this is a messaging app not owned by Meta, the DMA presumably provides on the interoperability. In theory, they should be able to, our members should be able to go to WhatsApp and say, you need to make it interoperable so our users can have their data transferred from their WhatsApp messages to their new application. Is that how you see it shaping in that way?
In principle, yes. Although I think there's one potential catch. The catch is for interoperability obligations. The European Commission will be looking at how the gatekeeper is making best efforts in good faith to provide these obligations, not the actual result of what will happen. So it's just the effort, not result, that is going to be measured at this point, which means it's really up to the new service or the MEF smaller member to make the best out of the rules and sort of work with the Commission as well to arrive where they want to arrive.
Right, so another opportunity for MEF to really, on behalf of its members and for the members to really show see the opportunity, and something mentioned in the first lecture as well, to really shape legislation and make sure it works in practice, so that our members can effectively have a better chance of competing with the giants. And as part of that, interoperability is going to be hugely key to see whether it really works in practice. We've seen this also to an extent on GDPR in terms of individuals' right to access the data, in terms of it really can be provided in a completely unintelligible form, which is of no use to anyone. We've got to make sure that the interoperability does actually work and enable our members to compete with new services which aren't necessarily a vertical of the Silicon Valley giants, which are now being categorized as very large online platforms or very large online search engines. Innocenzo, why do you think there was a need to update the legislation? Do you think really the EU is really ahead of the FCC, as we saw from Noah really lamenting the fact that FCC hasn't really taken on the dominance of the Silicon Valley giants in data?
Well, quite frequently people say that Europe is a champion of regulation, or Europe is regulating too much, is not looking sufficiently at business and technology. Maybe it could be a perception, but you have to consider a point. Europe is a set of different markets. You have 27 markets there. Therefore, regulating to harmonize is an obligation for Europe. Otherwise, it would be impossible to get services, cross-border services. Because in the absence of a European regulation, each member state will apply their rules, which sometimes comes from different traditions. So that's something that Europe must do. And of course, when you harmonize, you can decide a minimum level of harmonization, but you have to intervene. This is something that US and China, they don't have this kind of problem because they have an internal market. So when then you intervene for harmonization, of course, then you have to touch different points, and then you may have people who say, no, you are regulating too much, you're making business to escape. But don't forget that mostly are the Americans who are pushing for harmonization within EU, because Americans, they come first to sell their services and they say if you found a market with 27 legal orders, we cannot make business here. So you have to intervene.
Thank you. And say in the first session on digital regulation, we really saw how data just cuts across the whole mobile ecosystem forum, and obviously that's been recognised with these various data-related elements of legislation, the four data-specific, the DMA, DSA, and I think we're seeing now a new regulator, Simona, with effectively a regulator to be the coordinator of digital services across the EU. So I don't know if you want to mention something about that likely role and obviously the need to engage with this new regulator of digital services.
And under the DMA and the DSA, the Commission has been given vast powers to regulate, so to monitor and to go through infringement procedures and through the coordinator as well. But again, it's all happening very, very fast, and once the rules come into place in a couple of months' time, there will still be the need for all sorts of both best practice but also legal interpretations. So just to give an example, it's still unclear whether the designation of gatekeeper will be based on the broad category of the core platform service, so everything that a particular platform may do, and it could be different types of services, or whether that specific individual consumer service will be the gatekeeper. So even that will take time and it will take resource and it will take work with the digital services coordinator and potentially need to play out in courts before we know exactly what the precedent will be. But even with that aside, let's say everything goes very smoothly, again, very quickly, the European Commission will need to, or I'm sure it already has started, to put into place how you monitor the gatekeepers, how you make sure they comply. And the Commission is very much in hiring mode. So there's an entire new unit, for example, in DG Competition, established to deal exactly with this type of regulation. But the question is it enough? And at what point will it be enough? Because everybody will need so much guidance, including the gatekeepers and the smaller companies and potentially users. And then how will that work with competent authorities, with member states as well? So the resource challenge in this case actually is quite vast. If we look at the GDPR, which was probably the most ambitious undertaking at the time, so much was being done by data protection authorities in member states. Yet this is a lot more concentrated with the Digital Services Coordinator and the European Commission. So we'll probably see for the first time how that actually plays out.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. Actually, I think it might be an opportunity. Innocenzo, do you want to give the audience a quick overview of the Digital Services Act? We've really focused more on the Digital Markets Act so far with a few references to the DSA. Do you want to give them a quick overview of the distinction?
Yes. While the DMA focus on the tech giants, so if you have some criteria whereby you are deemed to have an impact on the market, then you are regulated ex ante like a telecom incumbent. The DSA regulate all the operators in the market, from small to biggest. Also, although the biggest they get a higher set of rules. And the scope of the DSA is to adapt the traditional rules on liability for illicit content to the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, to the fact that after 20 years the market had changed, because those rules that we know that were shaped in the beginning of the 2000s were imagined in a world where Google and YouTube were not existing, social networks were not existing, so they had to adapt those kind of mechanisms in order to improve the application. And then there is this scalar discipline whereby the biggest you are, the greatest set of rules you receive, and starting from the intermediary services, hosting operators, meaning passive services, platform, and very big platform. Then there are also some rules which are approaching the new phenomena which are in the internet, like for instance the content moderation. The content moderation is one of the big issue which normally have been self-regulated by internet service provider for years. And in general, the big platform and platform in general, they wanted always to have self-regulation. The DSA is changing the system, so is keeping self-regulation as complementary because they still ask operator to make code of conduct. But first, they set a number of rules. For instance, from content moderation, they provide oblige operator to have a terms and condition to be clear in the way content is removed or corrected, and to provide to users the possibility to challenge the procedure in front of a court or even in a friendly way. So the kind of things that sometimes the operators were offering, sometimes not. Yeah. Now it is ruled by the law.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one, possibly two questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, thank you.
What's your view for interoperability? What are you thinking, especially the UK government? What are you thinking in terms of getting Apple and Google to play nice? In terms of, like, if I send a text message and if it's on iOS to iOS, they make it a blue bubble and it gives a green bubble. And, you know, it'll be a good place for a regulator to come in and say, you guys should talk nice to each other.
UK will not be subject to the DMA, so I don't know what is going to happen in UK. No, I was saying that the UK will not be subject to DSA and DMA, so but of course for an operator like Apple or a big or a giant, the question is, can I shape my business in different ways depending where I'm operating? It is possible. It makes does it make sense? That's the problem. But technically, as far as UK is concerned, the new European internet rules do not apply.
And the UK is actually looking at its own version of the DMA, so it's possible to. It's not as advanced at the moment as the EU one, but it will be possible to engage with the legislators to raise this.
Yeah. So it is important. Yeah, as Simona says, it's probably a very good time to engage now, because we are looking at in the UK at the lessons from Europe, and it's important. And mainly, it's been focused to help really SMEs interact and compete with the very large online platforms from Silicon Valley, but less so, I think, in between them. But I think it's very, very important that is looked at, and we'll see how it is. And, you know, the Silicon Valley giants do have a lot of lobbying clout behind them, and will use lots of technical and security arguments to say, well, why it can't be done in practice. And that's why it's important for the rest of the industry to try to work to make sure they do adhere to these principles of interoperability, which will really enhance competition and help a lot of the, I think, the competitivity of our MEF members going forward. I'm not sure if we've got any more time. Maybe one last question.
Simona, you stated earlier, it's just the effort that matters, not the results. And I find that statement really concerning, because the average individual, they're not going to have any recourse. And organizations could say, look, I gave them data portability, I gave them a file they can do nothing with. And so how do we actually make this practical and operational to be able to give people sovereign control over their data?
I think the answer is still the continuous dialogue and the role of the Commission. So it will not be done and dusted, in May or whenever the obligations come into place. There will be best practice guidelines. There will be, again, guidance from the Commission being issued. So it will be, for the next year and a half at least, a continuous dialogue where you can raise exactly these types of issues.
I think the big thing is just accountability. Like, ultimately, how do we hold them accountable so the individual can actually serve and be served?
Yeah, absolutely. And in theory, the digital services coordinator, the new regulators, should be making it work in practice, and will be monitoring and the self-monitoring. But it's going to be a battle But in theory, the legislation provides for it. We'll see how it, works in practice. But that's the opportunity for us at MEF and the MEF members to try to make sure and feed into the regulators that it has to work in practice, and it potentially could work in practice, and don't buy these excuses.
But the concern is correct, because a best effort obligation by an incumbent, in my experience, is an alibi in case you don't want to deliver what you are obliged to.
Absolutely. So I think that's a very good note, ominous one to finish on. We'll be around for the next few hours to answer any other questions in the coffee. But I really want to thank my panelists in Innocenzo, Genna, and Simona Lipstaite. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.